Welcome back to my study. Today we are looking into the single most expensive, most controversial, and arguably most fascinating piece of European bureaucracy ever conceived. I am talking about the Common Agricultural Policy, or the CAP. For decades, this single policy consumed nearly 3/4 of the entire European budget. To understand why the European Union spends billions of euros every year on agriculture, we have to travel back in time. We have to look at the continent just after the Second World War. Europe was devastated. Supply chains were completely destroyed. Cities were in ruins. And most importantly, people were starving. The trauma of post-war food shortages left a deep psychological scar on European leaders. They made a solemn vow that Europe must never go hungry again. Food security became the ultimate priority. The founding nations of the European project realized that if they wanted lasting peace, they needed full bellies. So, in the early 1960s, the Common Agricultural Policy was born. The concept was beautifully simple and incredibly noble in its intent. The goal was to encourage farmers to produce as much food as possible. To do this, the European Economic Community introduced a system of guaranteed prices. They told the farmers that no matter what happened in the global market, the European government would guarantee a minimum price for their crops and livestock. If the market price fell below this guaranteed intervention price, the government would step in and buy the surplus. It was an ironclad safety net. Farmers could invest in new tractors, better fertilizers, and more land, knowing they could never lose money. And it worked brilliantly. Within a few years, Europe went from suffering food shortages to being completely self-sufficient. The farmers modernized, yields skyrocketed. The specter of famine was entirely banished from the European continent. But there was a tiny, logical flaw in this beautifully simple bureaucratic machine. A flaw that human nature exploited almost immediately. If the government guarantees to buy whatever you produce at a fixed price, regardless of market demand, what is your incentive? Your incentive is to produce as much as physically possible. Quality no longer matters. Demand no longer matters. Only pure, unadulterated volume matters. European farmers realized they had discovered a legal, infinite money glitch. They started producing food not for the consumers, but for the intervention boards. By the 1970s and 1980s, the results of this infinite money glitch became horrifyingly visible. The European Union was drowning in food it did not need. Because the government was legally obligated to buy the surplus, they had to store it somewhere. And the surpluses were not small. They were biblical. First came the butter mountain. Because milk production was so heavily subsidized, farmers produced oceans of it. When you have too much milk, and you need to store it indefinitely, you churn it into butter and freeze it. The European government ended up buying and freezing hundreds of thousands of tons of butter. The stockpile was so massive it literally defied comprehension. If you took the European butter mountain at its peak, it would have weighed more than the entire population of Austria. But it was not just butter. There was the milk lake. Millions of tons of surplus skimmed milk powder sitting in warehouses gathering dust. And we cannot forget the famous wine lakes. Farmers in southern Europe were growing low-quality grapes purely to sell to the European government. Vast, artificial lakes of mediocre wine were created. The wine was entirely undrinkable, but the bureaucracy paid for every single drop. There were beef mountains, sugar mountains, and grain mountains. The European Union had accidentally become the largest, most inefficient grocery store in human history. The logistical nightmare of storing this surplus was staggering. The European Union had to rent practically every commercial freezer and warehouse across the continent. At one point, simply paying for the cold storage of the butter mountain and the beef mountain consumed a massive percentage of the entire EU budget. It was an absolute scandal. Citizens were furious. Their tax euros were being spent to freeze meat that nobody would ever eat. The EU grew desperate to get rid of the mountains. They tried selling the surplus butter to the Soviet Union at heavily subsidized rock-bottom prices. European taxpayers were essentially paying to give cheap premium butter to their Cold War rivals. The optics were, to put it mildly, terrible. They tried feeding the surplus milk powder Back to the calves. Yes, they paid farmers to produce milk, dried it, and then paid farmers to feed it back to the cows. As for the wine lakes, the EU had to pay chemical plants to distill millions of gallons of wine into industrial alcohol and hand sanitizer. The bureaucracy had created a monster. The noble goal of preventing starvation had mutated into an unstoppable engine of overproduction. Something had to change. In the 1980s, the EU finally introduced quotas. They explicitly told dairy farmers they were only allowed to produce a specific amount of milk. But the real revolution came in the 1990s with the McSherry reforms. The EU introduced a concept that would change agricultural bureaucracy forever. They introduced set-aside schemes. To stop the overproduction of grain, the European Union literally started paying farmers to do absolutely nothing. You would receive a nice check from Brussels on the strict condition that you left a percentage of your fields completely empty. It sounds absurd to pay someone to not grow food, but it was significantly cheaper than buying the food and paying to freeze it forever. Then came the concept of decoupling. Previously, subsidies were coupled to production. You grow a ton of wheat, you get a fixed amount of money. Decoupling severed this link. Now, farmers receive a direct payment based simply on the amount of land they own and maintain in good agricultural condition. You no longer have to grow mountains of unwanted surplus to get paid. You just have to prove you are managing the rural landscape. This finally destroyed the butter mountains and the wine lakes. Farmers returned to growing food based on what the market actually wanted to buy. Today, the common agricultural policy is completely different. It still takes up a massive third of the EU budget, but its goals have evolved. Modern CAP payments are heavily tied to environmental standards. It is a system called cross-compliance, and recently, greening. If a farmer wants their full subsidy check from the European Union, they must follow strict ecological rules. They must maintain permanent grasslands and protect local wildlife. They must establish ecological focus areas and rotate their crops to preserve soil health. The modern European farmer is as much a landscape manager as a food producer. Of course, this means the bureaucracy has only gotten more complex. Farmers now spend countless hours filling out forms and mapping their fields with GPS coordinates. There are satellites constantly orbiting the Earth, operated by the European Union, purely to check if farmers are actually mowing their grass when they claim to be. The CAP is still heavily criticized. Large industrial farms often absorb the majority of the funds simply because they own the most land, while small farmers struggle. And the strict environmental regulations frequently lead to massive farmer protests in Brussels, complete with thousands of angry tractors blocking the streets. But despite its flaws, the system is fundamentally better than it was in the 1980s. It provides a stable food supply without generating useless mountains of frozen beef. The European Union learned the hard way that when you blindly guarantee a market, you end up with infinite supply. It is a fascinating example of how a well-intentioned policy can create absolute chaos and how a slow, giant bureaucracy eventually manages to fix its own mess. Next time we meet, we will look at the Brussels effect and the travelling circus of the EU Parliament. Have a sip of your favorite drink. Class dismissed.